Steve, welcome back to the Brainstorm Tech stage. When you hear that some big tech company lost out on the mobile revolution and now they're struggling, this is the guy they lost out to. Steve has been CEO for about 5 years, but you're a lifer at Qualcomm, right?
Pretty much, about 25 years.
You've got your name on dozens of patents. You're an electrical engineer. You're going to demystify this 5G thing for us, right?
I will try, yes.
Okay. Let's start by demystifying Qualcomm a little bit. We often describe it as a chip maker, but you don't actually make and print the chips. You design the chips. Tell us a little about sort of the two main businesses Qualcomm has.
Sure, and I would say we probably don't think of ourselves as a chip manufacturer. The history of the company is really less about that. It's really more about we have a vision for where wireless could take us. We tend to invent the fundamental technologies that create that. Essentially, what is it that we need to do as an industry to create a downstream industry that can use cellular? That tends to be shared with the industry through the cellular standards bodies, which we are very active in and have been for a long time. And then we provide chipsets, usually at a fairly high level of integration, including a lot of software, that make it easy for people to use our chips. Now, what happens is everybody knows the product business, which is the chip business, and it's grown over the years. So they think that's sort of what we do. But really, what we're doing is trying to figure out what technologies need to be invented and delivered at scale so that industries can take advantage of cellular. And it's probably more exciting and impacts more industries now than it was over the last 30 years of the company's history. We're about 32, 33 years old in terms of a tech company. And I would say the next 30 years are probably going to be more broad and pretty exciting.
Well, in addition to just selling the chips, you invent things that are at the core of mobile phones and other devices, and then you receive royalty fees, very lucrative royalty fees, on those inventions. And that's been sort of an area of controversy, shall we say, over the last few years.
Yep.
So one thing that happened, when you were here last, 2 years ago, you predicted that this big battle you were having with Apple, where they were suing you over the royalties and you were countersuing them, you said, it's going to be a settlement. It's not going to go on and on and on. Everybody kind of laughed. People didn't believe you. What happened in April? You settled with Apple. How did you come to it?
Well, it unfolded very much the way that we said, quite frankly. What happens, I think, there's always disputes about the price of IP. Sometimes those disputes are public. Sometimes they tend to use a global characterization. Remember, these are big companies, very sophisticated companies. But ultimately, what tends to happen is that these things get resolved, and then the normal working relationship between the market parties is what's left over. And that's really what we have here. If you look at the engagement certainly between us and Apple, and certainly between us and other companies, almost always after a licensing dispute, it settles down and the focus is really how do we get products out together, one way or the other. And that's really what dominates now. It's a much more comfortable spot for both companies, and very happy to have that.
Yeah, the stock market is very happy as well. Your stock is up 33% since that settlement. Yeah. But what was it like as CEO how did you feel when your best customer is suing you? Or one of your best customers?
Look, this is not our first rodeo here in terms of this. But the key thing, you just keep your mind, we always keep our eye on kind of what are the big things, right? And the big thing is 5G's coming or technology's coming, and typically if you have great technology, you can figure out commercial disputes, okay? And it really has to do not so much with are you selling a product to them or not selling a product to them. It has to do with your relevance in the industry and who should you be working together, and those type of things. And that creates the environment for you to go. So when all this sort of external stimulus into the company was very focused on pulling in 5G. So if you looked at what are people really doing, that's what they're working on. So we emerged from the dispute, and all of a sudden, you see that Qualcomm's got a very strong position in 5G.
So it was not a distraction to what the business of the company was?
Yeah, it's a distraction to about 10 of us, and certainly a distraction to me and all that. But the people who are really focused on technology, they're focused on technology because they love it, and they kind of understand how unique it is. And we have a great team, and they really demonstrated that during that experience.
Now, I said that his stock is up 33% since the middle of April, which is pretty impressive. Their stock was up 60% in the first few weeks after the settlement, when another one of these legal externalities, as you're calling it, dropped. And that was a court ruling out in California that the Federal Trade Commission was saying you're anti-competitive in your licensing practices. Now that court battle is ongoing.
Yep.
So your stock has dropped somewhat over the last month. But what's going on? There was some recent news on that just yesterday.
That's right. So we obviously disagreed with the judge's ruling.
Just a little.
But we're going through the process of a stay and then ultimately an appeal. And there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of things. But if you look, what happened yesterday was that the Department of Justice actually filed an amicus brief in the court. And a lot of people say sometimes, hey, the briefing speaks for itself, and they're sort of downplaying it. In this case, that briefing is so articulate, it's probably a better articulation than I could make in terms of why we think we're right on the law, why we think we're right in terms of process, and of course, ultimately, whether we'll prevail. And so I'd encourage people to read it, and just remember, the writing entity is not some random person. This is actually the Department of Justice, actually the person that actually, or the entity that holds the sway here, at least in antitrust law. So we were happy to see that. We think we will prevail. These disputes take a long time. And again, the important component of that is really, for us, is 5G is happening, we're launching it, we'll get through this, and the company will prevail. But it's important that we get through this properly.
Well, as I was putting together this morning's daily tech briefing for our datasheet newsletter, which I hope everyone is subscribing to, I did read some of the briefing. And one of the reasons they're offering for why you shouldn't be prosecuted in this way is that for the U.S. national security. Yeah. Why is Qualcomm important to the U.S. national security?
Well, but they also said we were right on the law, too, so don't forget that. But it really has to do with the relevance of the cellular technology. They essentially, I think, recognized our leadership position in 5G, and also then the importance of 5G. In this case, I think they made particular reference to the security of some defense, systems, as well as in the case of the Department of Energy, which also filed a declaration, the importance to the infrastructure and the importance of it being secure as it goes forward. But you could have had a number of industries that could have said the same thing. They're really just saying, my strategy for connecting my things is intersecting with 5G, and we need to make sure that the leaders that produce those technologies continue to be successful. And that's really what it's about. It probably has less to do with us in particular and more to do with our leadership position in 5G and how important 5G is to downstream industries.
Got it. All right, well, let's talk about 5G. Let's try and demystify 5G a little bit. So I got to go to Providence recently. Providence, Rhode Island is one of those few places that has 5G in service for consumers. Can we do a show of hands? Can we see how many people, or have any people in the audience tried a 5G phone yet? Just a couple over here, but not too many. Okay, so I tried the 5G phone, and I downloaded a Reese Witherspoon movie onto my phone in 10 seconds. Very impressive. But I'm not sure that's enough to make me want to sign up for 5G service. So tell us a little about what is this technology really going to bring to us besides just speed? And speed is important too. But
sure. So 5G really has, I would say, two components or two vectors of interest for the industry. The first one is purely to the cellular industry, and a lot of it has to do with what's the advantage for them of launching 5G, and it's basically two things. It is the ability to keep up with the demand of wireless video. So the people's wireless video demands continue to go very dramatically.
Reese Witherspoon is doing an Apple show, so we're going to have more Reese Witherspoon.
That's right, and even beyond Reese Witherspoon, there's also desire to get data. Although she's wonderful and all of that.
One of my colleagues was suggesting that we might want to download 600 episodes of The Simpsons onto our phones.
Well, see, but that's just an example of there's just tremendous amount of demand for data, and that will continue for a long time. And so what 5G does is it actually allows the operator to get access to that at about 1/30 of the cost, okay? And it allows it to have access to new bands, which gives it tremendous ability to provide services to the consumer, and in some cases even compete with wireline operators, which you're seeing.
Like cable.
Like cable operators. You see Verizon doing that, particularly in the United States. That's sort of one. So that's the kind of classic more G issue. And it has less to do with the dramatic impact to the consumer, although the data speeds, when people see it, they love it. Data speeds are tremendous. But it's just incredibly beneficial for the operators to launch. So much so that I think if you don't have a good 5G strategy and deployment strategy, you're going to be left behind. And the history of the industry is if you get left behind, you really never catch back up.
How do you think the U.S. industry is doing on 5G compared, around the world?
They're doing actually quite well. There's a lot of sort of rhetoric around that.
The race to 5G?
Yeah. What's happened in 5G in this first case is really that it's the first time it's a global launch. Typically, you see these technologies happen in one geography, typically Japan and Korea and the United States, and then it spreads to other areas. This time, it's actually launching worldwide. And of course, we had a lot to do with that. We basically run around, talk to the operators, try to orchestrate and make sure all of the industry participants are ready to launch 5G. But the reason that it's launching more dramatically worldwide has to do with the second reason of why 5G is important to the industry. And the second one is, how do I create the sort of connectivity fabric underneath of everything so that industries can take advantage of digitization? So if you asked essentially any industrial company, any infrastructure company, any healthcare company, what do they need to figure out? They need to figure out how they deal with the digitization of their stuff, their people. How do I remotely control things? How do I do it securely? Well, 5G was designed purposely to allow that to occur. And it's the first time that the cellular roadmap really intersects with these new industries. And we talk about how that's a similar transition to what occurred in industry when you had electricity or the steam engine and all of those things. Probably overdone a bit, but it has a significant impact. And so what Qualcomm tries to do is, first of all, we invent the fundamental technologies that allow that to occur. We put it in the standards bodies, and then we try to figure out how do I get that out at scale so that people can run these business experiments. And typically, it's about how do I create a bigger pie. And what happens is industries are being impacted that are serious industries as opposed to just consumer industries. Obviously, consumer industries is serious. But if you're going to figure out how you control the infrastructure of an industry or how I fundamentally disrupt the delivery of healthcare or education, that becomes industrial policy for countries. And what happens is countries say, I actually don't want to be late. So I better launch as soon as possible because I want to start running those experiments myself. And of course, that's great for Qualcomm. That's what you see is you actually see 5G ramping faster than 4G. Both in terms of number of devices, number of operators, even the sell-through of devices, if you look at what happened in South Korea.
Well, when do you think, so almost nobody had their hand up, when do you think, how many more Brainstorm techs is it going to be before like most people have their hand up?
Next year.
Next year?
Yeah,
all right, we're going to hold them to that one.
Well, I'll tell you why, because if you look today, you can go into Verizon today. You can buy a Samsung 5G device, S10 5G device, and it looks exactly the same as the 4G device. And in fact, people buy it, it has 5G in it, they use it for 4G, they don't even know it's a 5G device. And as the deployments come out, they're going to have access to 5G very dramatically, very different than what happened in the 4G transition. The 4G transition, remember, you had much thicker devices, you had a lot of, I would say, early teething pains of the technology.
Terrible battery life.
Yeah, that's not what you have today.
Okay.
And all of the things that people talked about that you wouldn't be able to solve, how do you get antennas for millimeter wave, how do you make sure that it works, all these things, they're already solved. They're in the devices. You can open them up. So we feel very, very good about it. And if you look at what the operators are ranging for next year, it's going to be difficult to not buy a 5G phone. Actually.
Okay. Well, I want to get into a few of the examples maybe to help people understand how 5G applies beyond phones.
Yep.
So one we were talking about is cars.
Yep.
Now, you may have heard or read that self-driving cars are going to communicate with each other and with the infrastructure over 5G. They'll have a lot of data needs. But Steve, you can explain it. So even before we get to self-driving cars, 5G could impact the vehicles.
Yeah, I think first of all, the connected car, dramatic trend, not only for, I would say, classic telematics. I want to be able to get things off of the car. But the user experience that people demand in a car now really has its roots, its DNA comes from the cellular space. I want software updates. I want streaming video. I want streaming audio. Well, streaming video, hopefully you don't have a lot of that. But you have streaming, you want streaming audio. And you want updates to the personality of the, that is what people demand. Very much, I would say, a mobile experience. So it needs to be connected. If you move forward, as you start to move into self-driving cars, you start to move in self-organizing traffic patterns.
We desperately need self-organizing traffic in Boston.
Yeah, and I would say that the technologies to do that we've been inventing for some time. You get the cellular, V2X, all these type of things. But what happens is the car is, the computing that's occurring in the car dramatically increases, but you also have a need for cars to communicate to other cars, oftentimes through the network, but oftentimes through the other cars. And if you talk to a car company, which I just came from Detroit yesterday, actually. I did exactly the same thing, this thing. They're all trying to figure out, how do I take this and change the experience of being in a car, the safety, all of these things. Pretty dramatic, actually. And it's great for us. Our problem is, how do I scale this up? How do I get the bandwidth to take technologies that are clearly important for these end markets, and how do I make sure that it meshes into those markets the way that they need them?
Okay, shortly we're going to come out to the audience for questions or comments from you, maybe more on 5G. So I want to ask you, one of the reasons why Qualcomm stock is sort of where it is that the smartphone revolution seems to be sort of almost played out. We're not really increasing at the rates we used to. Qualcomm has tried some other areas, server chips, laptops, smartwatches. I don't know, none of them have quite hit it yet. What do you think are sort of the best growth opportunities for new markets beyond smartphones?
Sure. I would say we do have a fairly significant non-mobile businesses. But the reality is we have a very significant mobile business. Now, and of course, when 5G happens, and you don't even have to believe market growth, like unit growth, in order to believe the following story, we're going to see an increase in the price of the units that we sell into 5G, and we will see an increase in the amount of content that Qualcomm gets on a handset basis. So I would say the dynamics of the cellular industry, even without market growth, unit growth, continue to be very attractive as 5G rolls out, and it starts to become a larger proportion over the next several years for us. So that's point one.
We, on the other side, probably will be paying more. That S10 5G phone is about $1,300 or $1,400.
But you're going to get more.
Okay.
That's the key thing. And then the second aspect is, our auto business, which I think has a $5 billion backlog, continues to be an important business for us.
How fast is that growing?
Tremendous. I mean, several years ago, that was probably $2 billion less, I think, if I was in CES a year ago. That's what I would have said, something along those lines. We have a tremendous business in, I would say, the networking and the Internet of Things. And everybody has an Internet of Things issue, but essentially what happens is, more and more people are trying to figure out how you get the combination of cellular plus computing and drive it forward. We're going to see that. But you're also going to see tremendous business model evolution in the opportunity for us to not only sell products, but also to help enable new industries to grow off these products. And maybe there'll be a different business model for Qualcomm. But you don't have to believe much more than 5G is going to happen and Qualcomm's going to get more per device to make it, we think, a very attractive company.
It's a strong pitch. All right, let's see are there questions or comments out in the audience. Wait for the microphone, please. And if you could just give us your name and affiliation. We'll start back here.
Hi, Max Rispoli. I just had two questions. One, you were talking about the 5G race and trying to get there. There's only a few telecom providers in the world. Is anyone not ready for that? Second question is, and I could be wrong on this, is there a uniform standard for 5G as there was for 4G in the past? And if there is not a uniform standard, how will that impact different types of 5G networks across the world?
Thank you.
Yeah, let me answer the second question first. Yes, absolutely, it's a unified standard. It's through the 3GPP standards bodies. I think very little, you hear a question, is it going to bifurcate into multiple? We don't see that happening at all, actually. So it's definitely a global standard. In terms of who's ready and who's not ready, there's always this decision that operators make, which is, what's the use case and can I afford to basically put in the CapEx that's required in order to deploy 5G? That tended to be a discussion that we've heard maybe over the last 3 years ago, we would have heard that. Today, you don't hear that much. Most operators have committed to a 5G roadmap, And they are in the process now of how do I get this out quicker? How do I get it out before my competitor? There are a few that are not doing that, or there may be an auction issue, meaning that the spectrum is not available. You tend to see this sometimes, perhaps in India, for example. They have yet to auction the spectrum. But the operators are quite keen to move forward on it. So our problem now is not convincing people how to go to 5G. It is how do I support this global launch, which is great. It's what we anticipated.
Okay, let's go. We have a question over here in the front.
Hi, Steve. Joel Myers from AccuWeather. We, of course, worked with Qualcomm back on Brew, starting in the 90s. Looking 5 years ahead, what industries do you think 5G will revolutionize that we don't hear much about, like medicine and some other kind of businesses that are really important, but we don't hear much discussion about?
Sure. So I think logistics, traffic flow, fleet management, how do you move things around securely in big cities? 5G is really tailor-made for that, really. We have always believed that healthcare had an opportunity to be disrupted by having secure communication. So this whole issue of how do I validate that the medical devices that people take home with them are secure enough and, I would say, authenticated so that I can make a medical decision. Probably less of a technical problem, more of a how do I solve the legal and sort of regulatory issues associated with that. Should we do that? Tremendous opportunity to both improve lives and in terms of create economic value. Delivery of healthcare or delivery of education, I think, is going to be significant. But really what people are trying to figure out is I have infrastructure, or I have people, or I have fleets, or I have things. If I was able to control them and to make decisions about the data that they generate real time, I can optimize my business, or I can even generate a new business. So perfect, very small example. Back in the early 2000s timeframe, Qualcomm had really the fundamental, almost all of the technology that was required in order to do position location. And the idea, what we were thinking about is, well, maybe it can go into E911 and you can find people if they have a medical, some sort of emergency. But in reality, very small technology went into the phone. It had position location. It had the ability to be connected to the internet. And that very small innovation created things like Uber and just tremendous business model innovation. Today, with 5G, we are creating more technology change in bigger industries. And I think that downstream innovation, which Qualcomm ignites but doesn't actually do, there's going to be tremendous winners and losers, I think, at a global scale. And so that's the reason the company is so excited about it. And we obviously participate as the pie grows, but not in the end service.
All right, I have one last question for you, Steve. There's been a lot of consolidation in your industry,
Yeah.
and not that long ago, you wanted to spend $40+ billion to acquire NXP. Then Broadcom came along and proposed the biggest tech merger ever. Then one of the former CEOs of your company talked about taking Qualcomm private.
Yeah.
None of those deals happened. So is there still something out there that you'd like to see that Qualcomm would acquire?
Well, I think there's always opportunity. We're focused today on driving 5G as well as, and I would say also driving the opportunities that we agreed with Apple on, which has a pretty good ramp. But there's always opportunity to participate in the consolidation. We think we have a unique sort of funnel of opportunities, and so the question is, what do we need to add to that to de-risk those opportunities? But
So what do you need to add to that?
yeah, well, we're not. Everybody tries to ask me that, but you can see where we're going as a company, and I think you can see the type of industries and things that are important. But we have, I think, a very stable, strong roadmap over the next several years that we need to execute on.
Great. Steve, thank you so much for the conversation today.
Thank you.